The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has made a decisive ruling that overturned a lower court judge's order which had previously blocked the federalization of the National Guard, a decision that now enables President Trump to deploy troops to Portland, Oregon. This development represents not only a significant legal shift but also a politically charged moment in the ongoing debate over the limits of federal authority and states' rights. The original injunction had been issued by a district judge who argued that the president's attempt to federalize the National Guard could infringe upon the constitutional powers reserved to individual states. However, the appellate court's reversal suggests a broader interpretation of executive authority, particularly in situations where national security or domestic unrest is at stake. The Ninth Circuit panel, in its majority opinion, emphasized that the federal government possesses the right to intervene when local and state measures appear insufficient to maintain order and protect federal property. In recent months, Portland had become a flashpoint for large-scale protests and civil unrest, with reports of property damage, clashes between demonstrators and law enforcement, and mounting tension between local officials and federal agencies. The White House had previously expressed frustration over what it characterized as a lack of effective response from city and state leaders, arguing that the deployment of federalized National Guard troops was necessary to restore peace and stability. The court's ruling effectively grants the president the power to activate and command National Guard units under federal status, which differs from their usual state-controlled structure. Legal analysts are calling this decision a potential turning point in how the balance of power between state governments and the federal executive branch is understood, especially in matters involving law enforcement and public safety. Critics, however, warn that this move could set a dangerous precedent by allowing the federal government to override state autonomy under the pretext of national interest. Civil rights advocates have voiced concerns that such deployments, particularly in politically sensitive regions, could escalate tensions rather than resolve them. They point to prior incidents where federal agents' involvement in local protests led to accusations of excessive force and violations of civil liberties. The Ninth Circuit's decision has reignited debate over the scope of presidential authority under the Insurrection Act and other federal statutes that govern the use of the National Guard. Supporters of the ruling argue that it provides the necessary tools for the federal government to protect lives and property when local responses fail. They contend that the situation in Portland had reached a point where intervention was unavoidable and that the president acted within his constitutional duty to ensure the enforcement of federal law. Following the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals' decision to overturn the lower court's injunction and allow the federalization of the National Guard, MSNBC anchor Katy Tur sat down with legal correspondent Lisa Rubin to unpack the far-reaching implications of this ruling. The conversation unfolded in the familiar cadence of breaking news coverage, measured, probing, and deeply analytical. Rubin began by emphasizing that this was not just a procedural victory for the administration but a decision that could redefine the relationship between state governments and federal authority for years to come. She explained that when the Ninth Circuit intervenes in such a politically charged case, it does so with the full awareness that its interpretation will likely set precedent for future conflicts between the states and the executive branch. Rubin highlighted the fact that President Trump's power to federalize the National Guard under Title 10 of the U.S. Code has always been subject to interpretation, particularly concerning whether domestic protests qualify as a threat to national security or public order sufficient to justify overriding a state governor's control. In her conversation with Tur, Rubin noted that this decision essentially expands the scope of executive discretion, allowing the president to determine when and where federalized troops can be deployed, a move that some legal experts believe could blur the constitutional line that separates state sovereignty from federal command. Tur pressed Rubin on whether this ruling meant that the president could now send National Guard forces into any city experiencing civil unrest, regardless of the wishes of local authorities. Rubin responded cautiously, stating that while the decision gives the White House significant latitude, it does not grant unlimited power. Courts can still review whether such deployments are justified under the specific circumstances of each case, but the Ninth Circuit's tone suggests a deference to the executive branch in matters involving national stability. The discussion then turned toward Portland itself, a city that has become a national symbol of protest, resilience, and division. Rubin pointed out that Portland's leadership has long resisted federal interference, arguing that local law enforcement is better equipped to manage community tensions. However, the Ninth Circuit's ruling effectively sidelines that argument by recognizing the president's authority to step in when federal property or personnel are endangered. Katy Tur, known for her sharp and empathetic interviewing style, asked Rubin how this decision might affect the morale and perception of the National Guard troops themselves, many of whom serve both state and federal missions. Rubin explained that the dual status of the Guard often places soldiers in politically complex situations, where they must balance loyalty to their state leadership with obedience to federal command. She added that for troops deployed